Hey everybody, it's me, DeoGenZ, and are you ready to go on an adventure? One that has never been told before, in a land that seems familiar with creatures you know and love, through generations 1 through 5. But in a landscape you've never been to before. Nobody's ever played and nobody's ever seen up until this point. Yes, I've been working on a Pokemon game, and what you're seeing now is the very first experimentations unto that process, and I'm here to tell and detail the story of it. So this is really old footage. I'm talking like probably taken in 2016. That was when I started having the first interests of the possibilities of hacking a ROM file, and this is a Pokemon Gold ROM hack. So we're going to see how far it got to. Not very far. But there are reasons for it. And in this first episode of me making a Pokemon game here, I'm going to detail why hacking a ROM file was way too hard for a beginner noob like me. I'm not a programmer. You know, I helped to make a video game in high school with technology to design team, but I was the story person. I had nothing to do with the coding. I was a beta tester, which is funny because of where I work now. But you know, it was fun to work on that game, but it was RPG Maker, and it was no sort of having to edit any code. And editing a ROM file really depends on hex editing. So if you're like me and you don't really know anything about that, and boy, I didn't. You know, it's very hard to follow. And it turns out the only way that I ended up making this demo you're seeing here, which is an actual gold ROM file, if you want to download it for yourself. I'm not really going to make it available because it's just it's a concept. It's not even fully playable. But the reason is it took so many different programs. So to edit Elm's Lab and edit the town, it took Gold Map, and to edit the starter Pokemon took a whole entire different application. It was like the trainer starter options, but I ended up using over 10 different programs to edit one ROM file, and the results ended up being a complete glitchy mess because I fundamentally didn't understand the ROM file. I didn't understand the hex banks or any of the binary code, none of that. I don't know what's going on. And all of a sudden, as I started to walk over the maps that I had redrawn in Gold Map, things got glitchy. Things started to not process right in the ROM file when I would test them out in an emulator, and I decided to kind of discontinue the project. But you know, I did get some ways, and it was interesting. It was a fun process, and it was definitely an eye-opening experience for if you would want to develop a game, how to do it, or not how to do it, because this is indeed so difficult. You can see here kind of my sloppy coding. I only had the ability to, in Gold Map, move events around, and you know, there's probably somebody who's much better at using the ROM editing tools than I am. But since I could only move events around like that person talking to you after you get your starter, which happens to be a legendary bird, so that was individually edited with an application, you know, I can't change anything about it. So that event is that event, and it will always be that event, because I was such a neophyte in using the tools that I couldn't fix anything. And you can see here, we do in fact have Zapdos. So an example of how we couldn't change anything was that Elm still said, hey, you received a Cyndaquil, when we clearly have a Zapdos in our party. So that's an example of how limited I was by ROM hacking. And like I said, this is just episode 1. You know, I'm going to do this as hopefully a weekly series in which I take you through my process, and hopefully maybe you can learn something about making your own Pokemon video game. I'm recommending you don't try to do it through the ROM editing process, and next episode we're really going to get into why when I show you the nitty-gritty, all the applications, all the hex editing and numbers and horrible things behind the ROM editing, when in today's world there are so many better options. So, I didn't even come up with a title for this one. But the concept was going to be something that it was like the player going through and seeing all these strange occurrences like this. What is this computer doing in this cave? And who are those people? And how do I get over there? There's clearly a way. Things that are on the edge of your peripherals as a Pokemon RPG player. That was something that when I was playing through Crystal got me so obsessed with the idea of going to places I shouldn't be, can't be, or just, areas of the map that weren't accessible to me. And the first time that this happened was in National Park, and me as a dumb kid, I thought, oh wow, there's this hole in the fence here. That's not supposed to be there. And when I go through it, there's an item. And I'm just trying to find Pokemon here. That was another thing. If you want to change the wild encounters, this total separate application, separate from Gold Map, separate from the trainer, starter, editor application, and so it begins to pile up and things don't work. But that grass was supposed to have Pokemon in it. But it's a perfect example. And so when I found items in the national park through that hole in the fence, I became consumed with the idea of what's beyond the gate. In Pewter City, there's a patch of wall that could potentially lead somewhere. And here's me reorganizing events, but not changing any events. It's still the Mystic Water guy. I just changed his location so the player could actually access him earlier. But I did do some changing around with rooms here. And the idea was that this was going to be a stacked tower, but once I started changing the room locations and redirecting the gates, those doors you enter through, there could be considered gates, it got so messy. I mean, like, you'd enter a room and things would get all pixelated and just horrible. So I had to stop editing the ROM file at this town. At Cherry Grove. This was Cherry Grove. I don't know what it would have been otherwise, but yeah. So, with a little bit of backstory into my obsession with the thoughts of what's beyond the gates, you're going to see what's beyond the code in the next episode and see why I don't continue making my Pokemon game in ROM file ways. Oh, but I do continue. I will continue.